This video is summed up in 30 seconds. A far-left writer at The Guardian interviews another far-left writer, Rich Johnston of Bleeding Cool, mentions a far-left creator, discusses a problem in an industry, while carefully avoiding the elephant in the room, the far-left ideology prevalent in the comic industry. Until you address that issue, stores will continue to close. Why are comic shops closing as superheroes make a mint? The latest Avenger film is expected to make $1 billion, but the shops that the characters are based on are battling to stay in business. Avengers Endgame predicted to make $1 billion in its first week. The superhero business really is the one to be in Hollywood at least. But what of the medium at which the superheroes originated? The comic book and the purveyors of the hundreds of comics that are released each month. The high street is not as bulletproof as multiplexes, and comic shops are having a tough time of it. Dozens of closures have been reported across the UK and US over the past few months. Last year, comics website Bleeding Cool documented how 50 comic shops had closed in the previous year in both the US and the UK. And since 2018 June, at least 21 shops in the US, 11 in the UK have closed, with others likely going unreported. While superheroes have never had a higher profile, the gap between cinema and comics has never been wider. The days when you could pick up the latest issue of Spider-Man or Batman from the newsagent's shelves are long gone. Last week, comic writer Ron Mars tweeted that during a presentation to a school class, one girl raised her hand and asked him where she could actually buy comics. So why are so many of them going out of business? Like other retails on the high street, comic shops must factor in rents, business rates, wages, insurance, like every other business. But the profit margins on comics are so narrow as to make this a very delicate balancing act, like every other business. There isn't a huge profit in comics and graphic novels, says Jared of OK Comics and Leads. Nobody gets into comic retail to become a millionaire. We do it because we love comics. Unfortunately, closures are a more and more common topic on both sides of the pond. Most comic shops don't make enough to get by if they make cuts. But some retailers depend on the generosity of family and friends to help support the shop. I don't understand. Are you saying the business begs? Some businesses actually do beg. They have GoFundMes, which blows my mind, instead of just selling better products. One of the unique challenges in comics is the monthly gamble on what will sell. Comics are released every few weeks as opposed to the collected editions available in bookshops or on Amazon aren't returnable. With 600 to 1,000 such items published every month, stores must make educated guesses or be stuck with their mistakes. OK Comics, 90% of what they get is pre-orders, with the rest put on shelves for casual customers. Smart retailers would rather under than over-order. Despite the launch of comic book apps, comics have weathered digital challenges better than other print media, according to Rich Johnston of Bleeding Cool, with digital purchases only accounting for around 15% of overall sales. Despite regularly reporting shop closures, he's upbeat about their future. Since the 90s, there has been a decline, but I think we run as many stories about shops opening as we do closing. So does the 50 store closing, is that a net closing? I mean, why wouldn't you tell us how many stores are opening and how many stores are closing so we could find out what the net is? I suspect because its numbers aren't good. The old image of comic shops as cliquish, unfriendly places where the uninitiated aren't made welcome, or as Johnson puts it, the sort of den in a basement staffed by a bloke in his 50s with a waistline the same size, is also fading. Survivors recognize that they must diversify by adding board games, food to the mix, while many of the closed businesses end up online. The industry's changed a lot. Sales are as strong as they have been for 20 years due to the internet, with 6 million comics leaving their hub in Cheshire every week. But even those on the inside are worried about the future. Lisa Wood, an artist for Marvel and DC, is also director of the Traveling Man Comic Shops after first working in its Leeds branch in the 90s. She says being unable to return comics leads to less risk-taking on unknown names. Marvel and DC stuff will always do well, but for a retailer, when money is tight, taking a risk on a new work by unknown creators can add up being very costly. She adds, superheroes have never been more in the public eye, but people don't come out of the cinema after watching the latest Marvel movie and head to the comic shops. probably because the people in the movies aren't the people in the comic books. They'll go online and buy graphic novels at prices the shops can't compete with. I think that in the future, the industry will move completely away from monthly comics and just produce graphic novels. But given that the monthly comic market is so important to the survival of physical retailers, it's worrying. Ron Mars's tweet. I did a appearance in a middle school classroom yesterday for Read Across America talking about writing comics. One girl raised her hand and asked, "Where can you buy comics?" Which just about sums up everything we're doing wrong in an industry. Javier says, I really wish the big two would make comic books with the interior pages printed on the old style newsprint so the cost per issue could be $1 to $2 and sell those at convenience and grocery stores and spinner racks. Marvel and DC, get on that, please. Mars responds, the thought that printing on newsprint would lower the price is a fallacy. Newsprint is not in demand as a paper stock, therefore it's not cheap. Woods says, Alterna Comics seems to be doing just fine. Creator-owned, affordable, cover price, fun stories, and good art, and I can buy them at my local retail bookstores. Alterna Comics official site. Paper stock is far from the largest cost of producing a comic. Mars seems to be doing a lot of pivoting and deflecting. He says paying page rates is not every model fits every publisher. I get that, and as a writer, I respect it. Alterna isn't the big leagues, nobody's getting rich, but it shows that not following expectations will work. Glossy paper and diamond have throttled the industry. Myers says, you know how tons of comic fans on Twitter are concerned about local comic store closings? Well, newspapers have been shrinking and closing for decades. Newspapers are not in demand. Peter Simeti of Alterna Comics says, paper stocks have nothing to do with the reason newspapers are declining. Magazines are declining as well, and those are on premium stocks. Back issue comic demand is booming, and most are on newsprint. And Indiegogo is also booming. Paper stock is not a factor here. Get ready for it. Content is. That's the elephant in the room. The content of comics. The Guardian article doesn't mention it. The people who work in comics won't mention it. It's the critical issue that everyone's afraid to mention. Anyway, the article also didn't mention anyone from the growing Indiegogo Comicsgate movement. You've got creators such as Ethan Van Sciver, Richard Meyer, Doug TenNapel, the Brightwisers, Mike Miller, Nasser Rabati, Antonio Bryce, Kanan White, Tug with the Littlest Umbrella, Ro Kamir with Vestige. The Guardian didn't mention them, didn't think to interview. Ethan Van Sciver is probably the biggest name in comics right now, because he's starting his own independent movement using Indiegogo. So, I don't know. It's sad that they have absolutely zero passion about a dying industry. And anyway, let me know what you think.